Everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jeff Williams, Chief Strategy Officer at Albrigo. And today we've got an amazing discussion, steps to become the firm of the future. I want to first introduce my panelists here, or my colleagues, my experts on this topic. First off, Ed Albrigo, the COO of Paladin Capital Group, and I'm going to give you guys a second, maybe if you want to introduce yourselves as well. Tell us a little bit about your background, and we'll get into the experience that you have on this topic. But Ed, say a few things about yourself, if you will.
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody and share with you our experiences of the steps to become the firm of the future and our choice of doing that with the Alvia platform. I've been at Paladin as COO a little over 2 years at this point. Prior to this, I was the CEO of an operating company. But Paladin, we are a multi-stage venture firm investor. We specialize in cybersecurity and deep technology. The firm is a little over 20 years old, and fortunately, we've experienced fantastic growth over the last decade, which caused us to take a look at the steps to becoming a firm of the future, if you will.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll get into that a lot more. Tim Friedman is also joining me, the founder of PE Stack, now part of Holland Mountain. Tim, introduce yourself, will you?
Sure. Yeah, Tim Friedman here. So I'm the founder of PE Stack, now part of the wider Holland Mountain Group. My firm, we work with primarily fund managers to help with technology strategy and selection. We maintain a comprehensive database of all technology and market data providers within the private capital sphere, which we use to inform our work with selection and advisory. Prior to founding PE Stack, I was the chief commercial officer at Preqin. I was on the board of directors at a portfolio monitoring business called Baxton, which was acquired by Dynamo a few years ago now. And in my spare time, I'm also an executive partner for TH Lee, working with their financial technology team on advising them on diligence execution for companies in and around this space.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Again, I'm Jeff Williams. I Chief Strategy Officer at Alvia. I'll see this a little bit. So today's topic is really about kind of tips and tricks, I suppose, and learnings from the road on the process of buying software. And that's relevant because I had the curse of having to buy work-related software early in my career. I would say it was sort of given to me as the junior person at a firm, and I found it really challenging, and certainly felt in hindsight like there were a lot of things that I wish that I had known ahead of time. So anyway, a couple of experts here. Ed, to your intro, you have a lengthy background, a bunch of relevant experience in this front, and of course Tim does this as a daily job. Helps people kind of navigate this process. So here are a couple of the things that we're hoping to cover today. But if you've been along with me and Alvia for some of these webinars, we don't like to stick too much to a script. We like to take advantage of the opportunity and where the conversation's going. So I think we're going to center it around kind of just at a high level, sort of what's going on with innovation in private capital markets technology, the selection process, and how to sort of size up the market and go about a search for evaluating and buying software. And then some tips on sort of understanding kind of what's going on internally, what problems you're setting out to solve, who to involve, how to navigate firm dynamics, and then of course a bunch of gotchas and ahas, or red flags, I suppose, is a little bit more dramatic. So we'll have plenty of Q&A, and I wanted to get this out early because I'm paying attention to the chat and to the Q&A here. So please do suggest topics, ask questions here. I think that the spirit of today's conversation is about hopefully empowering somebody out there to have more success or more tips to go about navigating the steps that allow you to kind of consider the technology that helps you to kind of build the firm of the future. So with that, we're going to jump in. Again, please do be active in chat and Q&A. I'd love to hear from you on specifics or topics that you'd like us to cover here. So I am going to go ahead and get rid of the screen share here so that we can focus back on our folks here. Let's start off here on this kind of innovation in private capital markets. Tim, you brought this up. I think it's an outstanding point. I think, you know, the idea that one is sort of faced today with a challenge or a problem that they're setting out to solve, and they say, hey, you know, this seems important to us. We want to become the firm of the future. Here's the sort of solution we're looking for. Can you help us navigate it? I think one of the things that makes you guys outstanding at what you do is you take a little bit different approach in trying to kind of help people understand what's possible. Talk to us a little bit about why that's important and to sort of not limit what's known.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that within private capital, we tend to see somewhat of a sporadic approach towards reviewing technology. Normally focused around events like fundraising, raising a new fund, we're going to take a look at our technology, or it's once in a few years we're, you know, not functioning on what we currently have. And people feel that they have, you know, an issue and a problem that they would like to solve, but it may well have been a few years since they've been in the market looking at software. And I think it's important to note that there's been a huge amount of innovation within the space in terms of who is providing the solutions. You know, new vendors coming into the space is one part of the thing, right? Another thing to consider is what are the existing vendors doing? And I think that's really important because the software providers that we're looking at are constantly innovating, or some of them are, not all of them are, but some of them are innovating and doing new things. And it's important to understand as you're coming into this, you know, what are people doing and who are the right ones to look at. But most importantly, it's more the art of what's possible, right? And that's where we really focus and start, you know, our attention if we're looking at a selection project. Is the first thing we like to do is just level set and think, what is possible? And I think it's really important for anyone that's coming into acquiring software to take a step back and make sure that you understand what technology is out there and what it can do. Reason being that there's been innovation that you might not be aware of, right? So by taking a step back and saying, well, let's map out all of your current workflows, processes. Are you using, you know, third-party administrators? What are the various ways in which you're sourcing deals, executing, how you're monitoring your existing portfolio, how you're doing your reporting? If you can kind of take a holistic view of all of those things, what we do as a firm is we help people to understand what technologies are out there, what solutions are out there to solve things that maybe they're not thinking about, right? And to make sure that you're not stepping into acquiring technology that might limit you elsewhere, it's very, very important, you know, just to understand what is possible. A good example of that recently would be, for example, the digitization of investor onboarding, right? So this isn't something that maybe if you last raised a fund 4 or 5 years ago, that you might not be familiar with, you're not looking at this right now. And it's an opportunity to adopt a new technology that's going to make your life a hell of a lot easier, that if you're not coming into the process with this on your mind, you might neglect to think of that. There are other examples of that kind of innovation that you might not be familiar with. And it's just important to make sure that you understand what's possible when coming into this, just the first step. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I've heard this quote, and I've heard it attributed to Henry Ford, but I don't know that it's accurate. So don't take my word for it. But it was something to the effect of, if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? And that's sort of, I think, an interesting way that I was just thinking about that is you're sort of limited only to what you know, and to the extent that there are folks out there doing a lot of really good work to make sure they're keeping on top of what's possible and what the innovation looks like. You know, definitely good to not sort of limit the possibilities coming into that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So,
sorry, I was just going to say, you know, and understanding, you know, that if you're speaking with firms that have worked with lots of other businesses and have the perspective of, you know, seeing how lots of different firms are operating and can kind of pull, you know, that additional perspective in as well, then that's going to be helpful as well. You know, what's worked at other firms, what hasn't, whether you're using a consultant or not, just speaking with your contemporaries and people at conferences and what have you, and what's working for them is also important. Getting that additional perspective from others that are doing these things.
Yeah. So Ed, I know you and I got to know each other personally as the result of you all actually working with Tim during a sales process. Talk to me a little bit about your experience in working with Tim and the PE Stack and the Holland Mountain team. I mean, I think that one of the things that you mentioned just in kind of prepping for this is that that was very eye-opening. That sort of becoming aware of what's possible.
It was, Jeff, and it gets back to your point about the innovation. Our main business is we're out there hunting for the most innovative companies, offering solutions of absolute need for cybersecurity, cyber safety. So scanning the market for innovative technology solutions for our internal needs is not something we're built to do on that part of it. So what we found in starting this whole process was we had our list of who we thought might be out there, but then we did talk to companies such as PE Stack, Holland Mountain, and others. Eventually went with PE Stack because of that notion of, and even before we selected them, getting information about what was out there we might not have even been aware of, for instance. And that notion of front to back innovation for us, from lead generation for fundraising, to lead generation to investing, to onboarding limited partners, the whole gamut. And one of the things we were searching for was integration across all of that. Right now, as many people on here probably have, different systems, a lot of spreadsheets, Word documents, to try to get an entire view, both of our investments, our investment performance, our limited partners out there. And so it was really important to us and eye-opening in working with Tim and engaging his group to see the options that were out there, and especially the spectrum of options from the very large, well-entrenched companies in this space to the startups in this space. And we're a firm, as we looked at it, we do want to see innovation, bring innovation in, but we're balancing the longevity of a brand new startup against maybe less innovative, but an entrenched big incumbent. So we weighed that spectrum and tried to understand where we wanted to be as a firm, which one of the companies Tim put on our radar was Alvia on there. And which great as we wound up going with your firm, but we found that very helpful, as well as for us, and I'm not sure how other firms are, it was very helpful having an outside firm like Holland Mountain help us with the procurement process to keep us moving. We set very tough deadlines for ourselves, and Tim and his team were very helpful in holding us to those deadlines. Because again, our main business is investing and fundraising. So very helpful all the way around, from innovation discovery to the actual selection of a system.
Yeah, no doubt. And I must add, Ed, from the counterparty there, and Tim, well done on helping Ed and his team. These guys were outstanding.
That's right.
Here's what I'm thinking, Tim. I know, well, I don't know what has sort of remained PE Stack as the combination with Holland Mountain come together. How do people that don't have the ability to hire you, which was like the situation I was in, going back to the sort of PTSD of buying software, what are the resources out there? I know the PE Stack had, the database, it was outstanding, and I hope that's still available. But what if in this case, becoming aware of what's out there isn't something that somebody has the capability of hiring a consultant?
Yeah, no, sure, that's a good question. I mean, I think there are two things that I would highlight. And understanding what the various options are and who the vendors are that could satisfy you is one of them. We do have results on our website that is free that showcases all vendors, so you can at least get to a long list and do some work and understand what they each do and how they compare. But I think the mistake that we often see made, right, and we often get called in after this, is really to try, what you have to try and do, right, is that you should be controlling this selection, not the other way around. And so sometimes what will happen is people kind of launch in and say, well, here are some names that I found that I know, I see them at conferences, or they email me, or I'm aware of them, whatever, right? And those may well be the best ones as well. I'm not saying that they wouldn't be, but that they're guiding the selection, right? The worst thing that people could do with this is to go into the process really unprepared and just set up demonstrations with various vendors where it's kind of, I'm looking for probably CRM, and can you just show me what you guys do? And then it's a great demo for the vendor because, they're just going to show all the best stuff. And you haven't really thought about your workflows and what's specific to you and what are the pain points that you're really looking to solve, communicated that, and have a real good tight metric so that you can compare between the different vendors and see which ones are actually going to satisfy you. Point being, you really need to understand what it is that you're looking for and what your requirements are, and let that guide which platforms you look at and how you look at them. That's the absolute key thing here, and the mistake that we often see made. Otherwise, you're forming opinions based on what salespeople are going to be showing you, which isn't a great approach towards this.
Yeah, you get a lot of, I use this historically, and so we're coming to you, or what do you think about them? And it's really funny. Sometimes you ask them the question, well, how was your experience working with us or with that product? Well, I didn't really like it, or whatever. It's like, it's not necessarily a correlation of like, we've used this, it's great. It's sort of like, it just, to your point, just a name that's thrown out, and now all of a sudden you're sort of being whipped around in software demos without sort of being able to kind of navigate right side up. So that's kind of what I was thinking. I was thinking, like, how do you balance this idea of understanding what's possible out there, right? Like, not limiting yourself to wanting a faster horse when you don't know that there are cars. But how do you balance that with not getting carried away and being realistic about the internal thing? So you were kind of taking us down that path, Tim, where it's like, how much detail is appropriate, how much is too much? Because I think, from my perspective, sometimes it feels like, priority lists become priority pages, right? And sort of focus is lost on like what the key problems being set out to solve are, in place of sort of checking boxes on multiple pages of requirements. What are your thoughts on that, Tim?
Yeah, so I would say you're right, in that you could go overboard. And as far as setting what the requirements would be, you need a really good process of evaluating, working internally, figuring out exactly what the workflows are, what you want the product to do. And there could be a period of looking at products to understand what's possible and getting to that point, whether you're using, if you're not, using an external consultant to help with that.
We did not take a very detailed approach on ours. We certainly did have a set of requirements broken out by the functional areas of the firm, stated at a relatively high level, some examples that would go along with what were the true pain points, and then got into the demonstration phase with a select group of vendors. So we did go through a quick RFI process, quick RFP process, but really got into, here are the high level list of what we'd like to see, as well as what's causing us pain. Went through some demos at that point, and then really broke it down into a demonstration of, show us how you solve this one key problem. For instance, for fundraising, onboarding, as Tim had mentioned. Show us how you solve this problem with aggregating information from a variety of spreadsheets, along with information we get from our fund administrator to help with our capital call process, our financial reporting process. Show us how you deal with connecting with our portfolio of companies to gather in their performance information. So it was not an exhaustive list. A lot of it was, here were key pain points. If the solution solved those, or had, at least we could see how we could solve it, as well as for us, what was really big was data integration, right? How are we going to pull? And we were very specific with, here's where we're getting information from Excel, from our fund administrator. We had 2 CRMs. Show us the model as to how this will all come together. And that actually went fairly quickly on that aspect of it, of getting through the selection process. And the other part, we looked at how vibrant were those interfaces with the system, the user experience with it. That really meant a lot to us, because some of the older systems out there, they still came across as interfaces of the late 1990s, early 2000s, and we're all used to much better than that now, whether it's in personal life or other aspects of the business. So one of the things I would advocate, are there a few key pain points across the different functions in a firm? List those, as well as some high-level requirements, but we didn't have the time. And for me, personally, from my background in other change initiatives, the patience for detailed requirements work. We wanted to get on to solving problems that we were experiencing and building through the data integration platform, potential problems downstream, as we brought on more limited partners, more funds, more portfolio companies.
Yeah.
I think it links to workflow, right? So you've got some ideas around, you need to, as far as building requirements, you might have a list of, say, and some people want to take a little bit further, but if you had, say, 20, 30 requirements linked to your workflows, and you want to get as specific as possible so that as you're differentiate between the different platforms, you're able to have some kind of model that dictates if they can solve these requirements, and you need to get quite specific around these things. And if you're leaving it to around 20, 30 requirements there, you can kind of say, well, which ones are absolute deal breakers? The platform has to do this, or we can't possibly take it, or which ones are nice to have. And you can just kind of get towards somewhat of a scientific way of evaluating products, and you can do weightings and things. I think there is value in doing that. And I do think it is important. And I think the workflow issue and linking these requirements to workflows is absolutely key, right? And so, for example, you might say, well, look, our process for collecting data from portfolio companies is we tell them what to do, and they'll happily do it because we have majority ownership in these businesses and they're evolved enough that they will do that. We would like to have one consistent template. That's our workflow. We got to maintain that. Okay, fine. So we'll now test these platforms, see if they align with that. There are others that might say, look, I'm a minority VC investor. I cannot dictate the format of which these companies are sending this data to me. I need a system that will support me, given what I'm able to get as part of that workflow. And there's quite a lot of differentiation between platforms as far as they could deal with one specific element of the workflow like that. The danger being that you adopt the platform and then it's like, oh my God, this actually is going to be really painful for me to use. I wish I'd really delved into that point. And so there are certain very quite specific things within your workflows that are blockers. Really try and focus on identifying what they are and make sure that the platform's a good alignment for that specifically.
Yeah, I love that. Make sure you're solving problems. You said that so clearly and emphatically, Ed. But and my coworkers at Alvia will chuckle at this because they hear me saying this all the time. And I think what a great question inside this process is like, but what's the problem with that? Because sometimes we just accept kind of surface level problems. To your example, Tim, it's like, well, we need portfolio monitoring. And it's sort of like, is there like a portfolio monitoring police force now that's sort of rounding people up if they don't have a solution, right? I say that all the time to be comical because I'm trying to encourage people to say, what problem? A portfolio monitoring solution is actually a solution. What's the problem you have? And it's sort of like, well, we need to get data from our portfolio companies. And that's what what's the problem if you don't? Or what's the problem with the way you do that today? because just that simple question, I think, Tim, to your example, can really start to tease out, oh, well, we get our data. The problem we have is that it's very cumbersome to get it. Now you're really starting to get on to something, a specific problem that as you start to assess vendors and build your requirements, now you're going to start to see sort of different cards being played by the different vendors and their capabilities. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a tick the box exercise. It really isn't, right? And there are various different philosophical approaches that different platforms will take towards solving some of these problems and providing solutions. And we often get asked, I personally am often asked, what is the best CRM? What's the best this? What's the best that? And I always say, well, look, it really does depend. And it's not a dodge of the question.
Sure.
And there are platforms I feel are better than others, generally speaking, but ultimately, it is a question of finding the right platforms and right solutions for, the client in question, their specific requirements, right? I think that really does come into it.
Yeah. So Ed, I want to go back to something else you said. You made it sound simple. So let's say that we've done this process. We're sort of building requirements and building lists of problems and understanding the problems of the problems internally. At the end of the day, you made it sound really easy to sort of wade through what came back and work with the team and the sort of committee. And I want to get into who you should involve and things like that. So we'll get to that. But ultimately, I mean, how were you able to sort of reconcile and navigate like the prioritization of the problems? Because I'll tell you, as a vendor in this category, no single vendor can solve every problem or every requirement that seems to be on every RFI.
So we talked about it a lot internally prior to even going into the selection process, let alone the implementation process. And several things emerged. One, we did as an organization set some pretty clear priorities for us. This area's problems are a must to be solved. This area's also needs to be solved. This area's, if we can solve them, that's fine. But not having a solution is okay if the other two are well served on that part of it. And we didn't find, and we also went into it, we didn't expect anybody to solve every one of the buzz areas. We came into it thinking, if we get to 80, 90%, that's great. And then we'll figure out what to do with the remaining parts if we can solve that much of our needs. And so it really took discussions from all the leads of the functional areas, as well as with our executive committee. This is a set of priorities, and we're going to be pretty ruthless about following those priorities and where do they lead us in the selection process. And that helped a lot. It also helped on coming up with, we were of a similar mind when you talk about the ease of requirements, that we were not going to go to a detailed level. We were going to go, I think Tim nailed it pretty well, probably 20 or 30 questions, types of requirements at that part of it. And certainly we had some breakdowns underneath that, but it was not our, if you will, requirement set was a relatively thin document, not a big book on that part of it, because we wanted to spend the time in understanding solutions to the critical areas and talk more about what generally is the harder part. How do we implement this? Boy, that looks really good in your demo. What's it going to take to implement? So the implementation and understanding that with the vendors became one of the selection criteria. Who did we believe was going to be able to help us the most, as well as help guide us in getting the system implemented relatively fast?
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm going to just sort of set aside a red flag or a tip or something here in that. We'll come back and kind of summarize them. But I'll tell you, from my experience, I had no idea what a software implementation was. And I happen to know from working with you, Ed, that you had the total opposite experience, right? Large contracts and things like that. And so I'm just going to say for the group that's with us here today, you cannot overestimate probably the importance of the success of implementation of most of this stuff that we're talking about here, right? Maybe not every solution, but certainly a thing that I've learned that's very important. And so, you called it out there. I want to get in, we're right there on the edge. So let's talk about kind of understanding internal firm dynamics. Again, I mentioned off the top, my experience here in buying work software was like right out of college, and sort of being naive, frankly, and not really understanding kind of firm dynamics and politics. And my advice to people generally is, hey, don't try to solve for firm dynamics and politics. Just so the second you kind of embrace that they're there, you become kind of empowered to work within them, and you can kind of do those things. So I want to talk a little bit about so now what we've sort of put our requirements together, and maybe we should have determined who was going to be a part of putting those together and functional areas and how we would prioritize and stuff. But let's just talk kind of broadly about the buying process, if you will, the evaluation process. What are your guys' thoughts on, and Tim, I mean, this is probably something that you sit everybody down and have kind of, advice for them right off the bat. Ed, you've just been through this. You did it wonderfully, made it look easy as well. What's the advice you typically give people on, here's how to think about who to involve? Maybe it's committee, maybe there's a single decider, or, just talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it varies the various stages as well, varies on the size of the firm. So there's a lot of variation, right? But ultimately, it's all about thinking, how can I de-risk this and give ourselves the most, the highest probability of success at the outset of the project, and make sure that you're aligning the process with that as far as stakeholders and who's involved. So we've done everything. We work with a mega fund recently around a middle office selection, where we polled about 200 people worldwide across a massive questionnaire of 100 questions, because this was a big, fat, complex project that we really needed to nail, get buy-in, make sure that everyone was able to give their view. We did a ton of different workshops with different teams, credit teams, and what have you, valuation, understand all the various different processes. And then we had a core selection group. And then we brought senior people in at the final level, having taken the time to understand what the sign-off process was going to look like, who the various key stakeholders are, go through a process like that. For smaller firms, it's likely to be completely different as a term, in terms of a process, but ultimately what's going to guide the thought process around who's involved is the same. What are the risk factors here? Who needs to be involved? How is this going to get signed off? What does that process look like? So that's one of the first things that we look at. Right? Who needs to be involved? Who are the stakeholders? Let's get them involved, make sure they've given their input. Who's going to be the people that's going to assess this? Do they have the right time? Can they commit to that to make sure we get through this efficiently? What's the sign-off process going to be? Who's going to be signing this off? What questions are they going to ask? Are they going to need to see a detailed evaluation? Are they going to trust you? Are you the decision maker? We don't want to have a roadblock at the end of this whole process where someone says, well, did you look at this platform or that platform? So that can also tie into which platforms are even being assessed, because sometimes we found that at the end, someone will say, how come you didn't look at this platform? There may well be a good reason for that, but ultimately, let's just include them from the outset if that's going to be the right question. So there's all kinds of things to understand when it comes to politics and ensuring that you're getting that right. Absolutely vital to map out that process and make sure that you have that set from the outset, in my experience. Otherwise, it's not just that things fail. You might make a bad decision. It can just drag on forever, or be a failed process altogether that doesn't result in something being picked efficiently, and you're just knocking stuff around for years.
Yeah. You can have too few and you can have too many, right? I mean, when everybody sort of, you implied this, you called it out.
I don't think you can necessarily have too many. I think it's more the level of involvement at the various different stages and things, right? So we can still get lots of people involved and get input, and there's value to that without having 20 people on a software demo, which is obviously crazy, and you couldn't possibly operate like that, right? So it's all around balancing the level of involvement of the various stakeholders in the various parts of the process.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. The difficulty of actually coordinating schedules, right, is an obvious one, but abusing 25 people on your team with software demos for 3 straight weeks. May not be optimal, but depends is the point, and there's a balance in all things. The age-old truth. Ed, talk to us a little bit about your experience. I mean, I gotta say, you guys were amazing. It didn't seem like there were any, and I mean that. I mean, we did get to spend a fair amount of time with your team, including with Michael, the founder, and I think the joke is, hey, you're all amazing. You don't have these issues, but really, I think the process was orchestrated well, and at some point, Tim and his team. I'll just take some credit for that, but you as well, having sort of driven the process. I mean, what was your experience on this?
Well, thank you. Well, number one, we're smaller, right? We're a 30-employee firm on that part. A lot of capital to deploy, but where we can, we will use platforms, outsourced service providers like fund administration, right? That is outsourced to someone that allows us to keep focused on the core aspects of the business, as well as leverage that type of external expertise. But for us, and you had met our founder, Michael Steet, through this process. And through there, it was very clear. We had a set of priorities all the way up through him, understanding what we were going to do, what areas we were going to attack with the highest priority, weaving off at that point. And we also organized it, and I know my colleague Frank Hodis, who leads our finance function, is on here, is that each of those areas were accountable for what they needed to do, and if you will, their sign off. And my job is to be that orchestrator. So as we get into the system, we're well into implementation now. It'll be up to Frank that says, the finance functions are met, right? It'll be up to our chief of capital development. These are met. My job is to make sure they get the work done they need to get done to be able to state that to us so we can eventually, we're getting closer to cutting over to the AIM platform as our main platform. So a lot of it did take getting into the process, having some pretty frank discussions with each other up front, and capitalize on, we're relatively small, we can make decisions quickly, and if there's contention, I'm right down the hall from the head of the firm, bring it up to the attention and get a result on that.
Yeah, I love that. I think that those things could be productive and yet intimidating and hard to kind of take on in the moment. Bree, our CEO, uses this phrase I love, which is easy conversations, hard life. Hard conversations, easy life. And so I think it's just a matter of, kind of recommitting. Everybody's trying to kind of focus on the same thing here. We can have different opinions, different viewpoints, but work through them productively. So we do have a question. I want to thank Chase for submitting this one. I think it's relevant here, so let's take it. So the question is, as firms become more sophisticated with their use of data and technology, what ongoing roles do you see firms needing to hire employees or consultants for? CRM admin, data entry, data analyst, engineer, scientist, developers, IT director, etc. And when is the right time to bring on those resources? I'm going to add one thing, and then I'm going to let you guys opine on this. Just sort of anecdotally, one of the things that Via has seen from this perspective is that technology isn't the only thing, right? We're humans at the end of the day, and we have roles and responsibilities, and interacting with technology is an important part of that. We've seen tremendous success with an offering. In certain cases have actually had desks inside our customers' offices, and I think it's important to distinguish that that's not necessarily needed. It's about an opportunity and taking advantage of an opportunity. And so I'll just say that I think, on some of these things, there may not be a formulaic answer to it.
Well, Chase sounds like he's about where we are. So his question resonates very well on this. So we think of it this way. And again, Frank Hodis and I spent a lot of time talking about this. So as we were evolving, one of the choices we had to make was around resources, given we used a lot of Excel, different CRMs, outsourced fund administration. We either could have started looking at, boy, do we need internal IT? Right now, we use a managed service provider for our IT. We don't do a lot of software development, but that itself was a key decision. We did not want to go down that path of customizing our own interfaces among systems. Who were the platforms that were there? And then relied on the partners we're dealing with, working with our managed service provider to help inform us of what was needed from a technical integration aspect of it, data integration aspects of it. I would say looking ahead, I don't see us needing an IT director. We have a very close relationship again with our managed service provider. They are our de facto IT director and team. But there are things that come up here on the list that are going to be very interesting for us as a firm, and it comes around this data analysis, and I'm going to call it data science area. So we're already looking at, as we finish this implementation, we're going to have our information for the first time in a model and integrated in a fashion we could do queries we actually never thought about doing before, because it was just too damn hard trying to understand where data was, conforming that data, running analysis on it. So I do think, and we'll discover this, that there's going to probably be a need for that data analysis role. And I'll give it by this example. Our front office team can't wait to get this system in place, have a uniform body of financial information, portfolio information. When I think about the hiring we do for that team, from analyst all the way up through senior investment lead, managing director, we mainly look at, can you get deals done? Can you scout deals? Can you get deals done? Yes, there's some analytics that are involved with that, but I do think we're approaching a point, once we get this integrated system in, we're going to have to think about, do we start now populating that team with data analysis? I don't think we need a big number of them. Hopefully, AIM and Answer do all that for us, right? It's a relatively, I believe it will be from what we've seen with our data so far. But that to me is the requirement. What we're going to need is shifting, and we're going to need to start thinking about that data analysis role in the company that does not now exist. And my belief is it'll be a very productive role for us and give us great opportunities to really start pulling apart what we know and getting some insights off a vast amount of data we have for ourselves.
Yeah. Tim, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I could talk about this one for ages.
I'm sure.
First of all, right, first point, I'll come back to the question in a second, but the first point I would make is we're talking about was the steps to become the firm of the future, right? And ultimately, what we're really talking about with all these applications is data, right? They're databases sitting underneath applications, and there are various things going on. But I think it's just really important to point out that making sure that you have access to the data that you're going to need, and that you have the flexibility and availability of that data, and you're not tied into a system that's not going to support more advanced data initiatives, is problematic and something that should be considered as part of the process. Even if you don't have an immediate need or understanding of how you might be using that data, it's important that you maintain that flexibility. And being the firm of the future, you want to avoid being the firm of the future today, and then in a few years' time, you're not anymore because you haven't thought about data and strategy and wider things outside of the application side of things. But back to the question, the biggest mistake that we see people make here, right, is hiring people to build stuff that already exists. That's a big problem in this industry. We see this quite a lot, right? And so there are solutions for, data science initiatives. My business, we have a data platform. I'm not going to sit here and use this as a chance to kind of push that, right? But we have a platform. There are others out there. We've already mapped out connections to loads of different platforms. It serves as an integration hub. We can do all kinds of exciting things with that data. But that's the point, right? The exciting part is manipulation of the data, building models, understanding various things. I think the mistake that you can make is spending time and resources building the stuff that's already been done, or that is boring, that isn't providing much value, and not putting your resources into the places where there really is good value to be had, right? And so, we're talking about the question that when do we need to start hiring for various different things? I mean, first of all, I think it's how do we accomplish the initiatives that we have, and just understanding what the most efficient, valuable way of accomplishing certain things would be. So if you're trying to do some more advanced things around how you're sourcing deals and get some automation in there, you really want to think about, well, look, like, what could I buy to accomplish 70% of this? And then it might be a case of understanding, who do I need to hire and what position to get to the rest of it, and making sure that you've thought about the entirety of what your options would be around that. And I think as well, understanding where real true value add comes into play will help guide those decisions. So for things like administration, data entry, stuff like that, it's a cost thing. So you're thinking about, well, look, like, how many hours of my existing people will go into maintaining these platforms? Could I outsource this? But to be honest, it's also boring. Like, there are various boring aspects of technology that you can outsource because your people don't want to do them, right? It's very difficult to get good people. And I kind of find sometimes we'll look at some short-sighted decisions as far as when we should be outsourcing and using consultants for things like CRM administration, on the basis that, is it worth it? We could have existing people do that. It's like, there are plenty of firms now that are outsourcing this and giving their employees a much more pleasant working environment, and you're missing out if you're not taking advantage of that, because there are people that will walk if they have to do some of the more menial side of things. And so I think looking at opportunities to outsource the non-value add stuff and really focusing on the value add stuff is important. It doesn't really answer the question of like the specific times at which you would hire some of these things, but I do think it varies. I would say we're now starting to see data science positions, data engineering positions at firms in the mid to high hundreds of millions range, initiatives around, data lake, data warehouse initiatives at that lower level, people using alternative data, pulling things in, and focusing their resources on maximizing the benefit, those kinds of initiatives at firms in the mid to high hundreds of millions of range, where that used to be the preserve of the really big, fat, giant firms. Definitely that's moving down. There are now more productized versions of these things out there. And so I would encourage people to understand and evaluate what options exist to accomplish some of the more advanced data science initiatives they might have in mind, because there are various ways of accomplishing these things. And it's certainly more accessible now than it used to be, through a mix of hiring, buying products, using consultants.
Yeah. Well, and I think the tendency in a lot of these firms, no judgment, is to sort of just excel harder, right? It's like, oh, well, we can do that ourselves. We'll just, we have folks that are really good at Excel. And I tell you, I suffer from that tendency. I'm on record as believing Microsoft Excel is the greatest software application to ever exist. However, it's a very different thing when we start talking about data. And Ed, you mentioned data models, and I'll tell you, I'm always amazed at how often problems people have come back to the basics of the way that their data is structured, and sometimes there's sort of gives and takes among the vendors, of which we're one here in this category. But sometimes you may not always know it, but you might be making a trade for sort of 2 clicks you get one with one vendor, but there might be something going on with the data model too. You just never know. That's sort of the dirty kind of inside secret is it's not always clear. And at the end of the day, there's a sort of big, thick wall that you stand to run into with proper or improperly formatted data, whether it's in applications or whether it's in Excel, which is, latter is oftentimes the tendency of what people turn to kind of solve an acute problem when they say, well, we could do this ourselves. We don't need to, go get a product or service or hire anybody. We'll just, I think I can figure this out in Excel. And I love that spirit, but it can run out of gas pretty quickly.
I came at the need for platforms such as yours from the painful experience of believing that former. Oh, sure. Get a couple really smart people, integrate some Excel data, we're good to go. And then finding the issues with the timing of data. One part of the firm has it at one state and another part has it at a different time. You start doing your analysis and nobody understands what's going on. And unfortunately here at Paladin, I give a lot of credit to the team who has been here a long time. That was one of the fundamental areas for a vendor such as you to solve for us, making sure that data is integrated. And in our implementation, we've been spending a significant amount of time, and it's been helping us normalizing that information across the different functions that use it, knowing that an investor may have been called one name in one system and a slightly different name in another one. But when going through and normalizing that information and understanding how the platform handles that has been enormously beneficial for us.
Yeah. So it can be pretty boring stuff sometimes, but it's important. You don't want to skip over it for the flashy stuff. I think that probably from what I've seen, a lot of people would say, and I think to the extent I've chosen software in any role I've been in, that it's very easy to get, enamored. Demos have this sort of inherent dynamic where you get caught up in a lot of visual things and you can sort of lose sight of some of the things that aren't always so visual. And I think if you sort of built a list of requirements right after you really settle in and realize kind of where you make good decisions and bad ones, maybe they're a little bit different, maybe they're not from the ones you started out with. So I do want to just take a minute. We've got these amazing folks here with tremendous experience. Please do, if you have a question you're holding on to and you haven't asked it yet, please do. I'll just take us out here real quick and I'll keep an eye on the questions. There's red flags, gotchas, ahas. I know, we swapped a couple of them. Ed, why don't you kick us off? What are some of the gotchas? You're sort of in this. You're working with our team on implementation, so I'm sure there's
sure. I'm going to call it red flags or gotchas from the organizational aspect of it, and then from the implementation. So from the organizational, it really is about maintaining that focus on priority. And a red flag could be, and we meet several times a week as both the management team internally and then with the Alvia team on working through the implementation, on prioritization, because it can go awry really fast if you don't maintain that discipline of it. For us, the other big red flag area, as we even started this, was the data. Where is it? Who owns it? Who's responsible for cleaning it, for validating it? And the reason is, Jeff, is because of one thing you talked about. It's boring doing that work, right? It's just really boring, but it has to be done. And I will say your team has been fantastic in working with us in handling some really nuanced, but potentially very complicated management of our information between how one side of the firm is using it versus another. And so to me, that's one of the things as people set up these projects, don't underestimate the complexity of dealing with the data management issue to prep it for the system on that part of it. And it has taken a good amount of time and focus by our team, but we believe that's where we're going to really have benefit once we get everything input into the system. We're almost done with our investor side information. We're almost done with our investment information, and now we're transitioning to the portfolio companies. And the reason why I say that's important, we discovered as doing this, the functionality didn't really come alive for us until we saw our own data in the system, until we started seeing the generation of reports and information and said, well, that's not what we expected. Here's what we would like to see. And it really came alive for us once we started getting portions of our data in the system. And I think it's going to move us along very rapidly here.
Yeah, I got to see that, and you're not alone, right? I mean, sometimes the sort of made up data that we use in demos and stuff can be tricky. As soon as you start to see trends or names, stuff like that, it's a totally different thing. Tim, you could spend an hour talking just about gadgets. I want to throw one out real quick, just for the audience here. Is when you're working with folks like Tim, alignment of interest with consultants, I think is an important one. I mean, you guys, I'm jumping in to sort of throwing out for you. I think you guys are outstanding. The way that you work with folks is from what I've seen, at least, sort of has fewer conflicts than maybe some other models. So that's one that I'll throw out as it relates to Tim. But what are some gotchas? I mean, you're a total expert in this.
There are so many. I mean, one of the things that we are really clear on is that we are compensated by clients. We don't have referral agreements with their various vendors, and obviously, if you're seeking advice from others and just understanding and asking everyone to be transparent about any conflicts of interest that might occur as a result of agreements that are in place, referrals, implementation agreements, what have you. It might not even be a problem. It's just more a case of understanding exactly where everyone is sitting as far as using consultants, and if they get platform fees or whatever from resulting from the things that they're doing. I'll throw out some red flags there, right? One is pricing. I would say, like, if you're looking at pricing, it's really important as you're considering the cost of these things that you model this out and think, well, here's the metrics, here's the way in which they're pricing this up. What's that going to look like when I raise my next fund, subsequent fund? How are these things being priced and how are they going to increase over time? Does that make sense? Should I be arguing and pushing back against that so there's good alignment long term? One thing I'll highlight. Another thing would be around implementation. It's always a red flag to me when I hear any comments from any vendor around how long implementation takes, because the biggest variable in that is normally on the client side. And so if you kind of talk to vendors, it's like, well, once that they can do the implementation in a month, and these guys say 6 months. To be honest, the biggest variable is making sure that you're set up on the client side to do that properly. And sure, you need to make sure they can do the implementation and go deep into that, look at the statement of work, get all that right. But I always take comments around implementation with a pinch of salt. Last thing would be anything to do with integrations and connections between different systems. Don't take any of that stuff at face value. If someone says, let's say you're using Preqin, you use that as a core part of your fundraising process. You want to get that LP data into the CRM. You want to make sure that there's an integration around that. If they say, well, we don't have an integration, but we have an open API so we can do anything, don't just tick the box, because in that scenario, okay, well, you're going to have to go to Preqin, pay them an absolute fortune for their API data feed, right? Then you're going to have to build some kind of integration hub, which you're going to have to maintain in order to work with these APIs and populate this and do a custom development. Are you ready for that? Probably not. So make sure that you're thinking about integration and what that actually means and how you're going to be able to accomplish certain things. That's another red flag that we see. Always make sure that you don't take things at face value and actually delve into these things where it could be a key point of differentiation.
Nailed it. Well, I'm going to take the case that we answered all the questions. Nobody, do you see one more? I'm going to wrap us up here because we're at the top of the hour. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I appreciate your insights. Outstanding. I wish I had participated and listened in today prior to have done this the first time in my career. Thank you all that have joined us today. Most grateful, and let us know how we can help. We're here for you. So thank you again, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Have a good day.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Ed.